On the morning of July 5, 2002, Ted Williams was taken from his home in Citrus Hills, Florida, to a hospital 8 miles away. He was 83 years old. His heart had been failing for years. His body, the body that had once been the most finely tuned hitting instrument in baseball history, had been breaking down since the late 90s, weakened by strokes and congestive heart failure, and a heart that could no longer do what it had once done. At 8:49 in the morning, Theodore Samuel Williams was pronounced dead of cardiac arrest at Citrus Memorial Hospital in Inverness, Florida. He had wanted to be cremated. His will said so. He wanted his ashes scattered over the Florida Keys, over the water where he had spent decades fishing. That is not what happened. Within hours of his death, his body was packed in ice and flown to a cryonics facility in Arizona. His son made the arrangements. His eldest daughter was not told. There was no funeral. There was no grave. There was no memorial. The greatest hitter who ever lived was frozen in a steel tank in the desert. This is the story of the final 48 hours of Ted Williams, the greatest hitter who ever lived, the Marine who flew combat missions in 2 wars, the man who used his Hall of Fame speech to fight for players who had been denied their chance, and the family feud that denied him his final wish. Theodore Samuel Williams was born on August 30, 1918, in San Diego, California. His father, Samuel, was a photographer and wanderer who drifted in and out of the family's life. His mother, May, was a Salvation Army worker who spent more time on the streets of San Diego helping strangers than she spent at home with her 2 sons. The neighborhood kids called her Salvation May. Ted grew up essentially alone. He spent his afternoons at the North Park playground, hitting baseballs until the sun went down. When the playground closed, he walked to a nearby lot and swung at imaginary pitches under the streetlights. He was obsessed with hitting in a way that went beyond passion. It was compulsion. From the time he was 8 years old, Ted Williams wanted one thing: to walk down the street and have people say, "There goes the greatest hitter who ever lived." He attended Herbert Hoover High School in San Diego, where he pitched and played outfield. The San Diego Padres of the Pacific Coast League signed him at 17. The Boston Red Sox purchased his contract, and in 1939, at age 20, Williams arrived in the major leagues. He was immediately, insufferably, brilliantly great. He hit .327 with 31 home runs and 145 runs batted in as a rookie, leading the American League in RBI. Veteran pitchers could not figure him out. Veteran hitters watched him take batting practice and shook their heads. Nobody had ever seen a young player study hitting with such ferocious intensity. Williams treated the batter's box like a laboratory. He divided the strike zone into 77 individual cells, each the size of a baseball, and calculated his batting average for pitches thrown to each cell. He knew which cells he could drive and which cells he should lay off. He knew the spin rates of every pitch before spin rates had a name. He knew the release points of every pitcher he faced. He catalogued all of it in a mental database that he carried for 22 years. He was 6'3" and 175 pounds, long and lean, with wrists like whips and a swing so quick that high-speed cameras of the era could barely capture it. His eyes were measured at 20/10 vision, meaning he could see at 20 feet what most people could only see at 10. He claimed he could see the seams on a spinning baseball as it left the pitcher's hand. He claimed he could see the ball flatten against the bat at the moment of contact. Nobody believed him. Nobody could disprove it either. He was also the most stubborn man in baseball. He refused to swing at pitches that were a fraction of an inch outside the strike zone, even with 2 strikes, even with the game on the line, even with the crowd booing him for taking a close pitch. Umpires admitted that Williams had a better eye for the strike zone than they did. His discipline at the plate was superhuman. He walked 107 times as a rookie because pitchers were already afraid to give him anything to hit. In 1941, he hit .406. It was the last time any player in Major League Baseball hit .400 in a single season, and it has now been over 80 years since anyone has come close. On the final day of the season, his average sat at .399.5, which would have rounded up to .400. His manager, Joe Cronin, offered to let him sit out the doubleheader against the Philadelphia Athletics and preserve the mark. Williams refused. "I do not want to back into anything," he said. He played both games of the doubleheader, went 6 for 8, and finished at 406. He went out and earned it because Ted Williams did not take shortcuts and did not hide from challenges. He won the Triple Crown in 1942, leading the league in batting average at 356, home runs with 36, and runs batted in with 137. It was the single greatest offensive season of the 1940s. Then he left for the war. He served as a Marine aviator for 3 years during World War II, training pilots at bases in Florida and North Carolina. He was preparing for deployment to the Pacific when the war ended. He returned to baseball in 1946 without having seen combat, but with 3 years of prime at-bats gone forever. He hit .342 with 38 home runs and won the American League Most Valuable Player award in his comeback season, as if the war had been a minor inconvenience rather than a 3-year interruption. He won a second Triple Crown in '47, hitting .343 with 32 home runs and 114 runs batted in. But the Most Valuable Player voters gave the award to Joe DiMaggio, whose Yankees had won the pennant. One Boston writer left Williams off his ballot entirely, reportedly because Williams had been rude to the press. The snub became one of the most controversial Most Valuable Player votes in history and fueled Williams' lifelong hostility toward the Boston media. In 1952, at the age of 33, with his career in full bloom, the Marines called again. Korea this time. Williams flew 39 combat missions in an F-9F Panther jet fighter, missions that were genuinely dangerous and placed his life at risk every time he climbed into the cockpit. On one mission in February of 1953, his plane was struck by enemy ground fire over enemy territory. The hydraulic system failed, the landing gear jammed, warning lights flooded the cockpit. The plane caught fire. Williams had to fly the burning aircraft back to base at over 200 miles per hour, navigating through enemy airspace with a failing plane and no landing gear. He made an emergency belly landing on the runway at K-13 Air Base, the plane skidding across the tarmac, trailing a sheet of flames behind it. He climbed out of the cockpit and walked away. His wingman that day was Captain John Glenn, the future astronaut and United States Senator. Glenn later said Williams was one of the bravest men he had ever known. He lost nearly 5 full seasons to 2 wars, 5 seasons of prime at bats, 5 seasons of home runs and batting titles and runs batted in totals taken from him by military service. Williams never complained, he never asked for sympathy. He never claimed the lost seasons entitled him to special treatment. Years later, he said, "The 3 years that I lost, hell, there were 9 billion guys who contributed a lot more than I did." He came back from Korea and kept hitting, as if the war had been nothing more than a long rain delay. He hit .345 at 38, .328 at 40. In his final at-bat on September 28, 1960, at Fenway Park, at age 41, he hit a home run off Jack Fisher of the Baltimore Orioles. He rounded the bases and jogged into the dugout without tipping his cap. Ted Williams never tipped his cap. The writer John Updike was in the press box that day and wrote one of the most famous lines in American sports journalism: "Gods do not answer letters." He retired with a .344 career batting average, 521 home runs, an on-base percentage of .482, the highest in baseball history, and the knowledge that he had achieved exactly what he set out to do as an 8-year-old boy hitting baseballs under the streetlights in San Diego. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1966 on his first ballot, receiving 93.4% of the vote. His induction speech became one of the most important moments in the history of the institution, not because of what he said about himself, but because of what he said about others. Standing at the podium in Cooperstown, at the pinnacle of his professional life, surrounded by the greatest players in baseball history, Ted Williams used his platform to advocate for the men who had been excluded from the hall because of the color of their skin. I hope that someday the names of Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson in some way can be added as a symbol of the great Negro players that are. After retirement from playing, Williams managed the Washington Senators from 1969 through '71. He was not a natural manager. He was too impatient with players who did not share his obsessive approach to hitting, too frustrated by pitchers who could not execute. too demanding of men who simply did not have his talent. But in his first season, he led the Senators to an 86-76 record, their only winning season in Washington before the franchise moved to Texas and became the Rangers. He managed one more year in Texas before retiring from the dugout for good. He spent decades fishing in the Florida Keys, pursuing bonefish and tarpon with the same scientific intensity he had brought to hitting. He wrote The Science of Hitting, which remains the definitive work on batting technique more than 50 years after its publication. He lived in Islamorada, Florida, in the Keys, then later moved to a home in Citrus Hills, a retirement community in central Florida near the Gulf Coast. He married 3 times. His first marriage to Doris Soule produced his eldest daughter, Bobby Jo, and ended in a bitter divorce. His second marriage was brief. His third wife, Dolores Wetach, a former Miss Vermont and Vogue model, gave him 2 children, John Henry, born in 1968, and Claudia, born in 1971. That marriage also ended in divorce in 1972. Williams was not built for domesticity. He was built for hitting. He lived for 20 years with Louise Kaufman, a woman his biographer Richard Ben Kramer called the love of his life. They never married, but were inseparable, sharing a life of fishing, quiet evenings, and the kind of genuine companionship that Williams had never been able to sustain in any of his formal marriages. She died in 1993, and her death left a void that was never filled. After Louise's death, Williams grew increasingly dependent on his son John Henry, who moved into the Citrus Hills home and gradually assumed control of his father's finances, his schedule, his public appearances, and eventually his daily life. John Henry was ambitious and entrepreneurial, but his business ventures repeatedly failed. He launched an internet company called Hitter.net, using his father's name and image to attract investors during the dot-com bubble. It collapsed. He arranged memorabilia signings and autograph sessions that generated revenue but also raised concerns among family friends who believed the aging legend was being used. In 1998, the Florida Department of Children and Families investigated a report that Williams was being underfed and confined to his home. An aide had raised concerns about Ted's care. The investigation found nothing substantiated, but the accusation added to the growing unease about John Henry's influence over his increasingly frail father. Despite his declining health, Williams remained engaged with the game. He watched every Red Sox game on television. He still commented on current hitters with the analytical precision that had defined his entire career. He was still Ted Williams, still sharp, still opinionated, still the greatest student of hitting the sport had ever produced. One of Ted Williams' final great public moments, and arguably the greatest pre-game ceremony in the history of baseball, came at the 1999 All-Star Game at Fenway Park in Boston. It was the 70th Midsummer Classic, and Major League Baseball had chosen the ballpark where Williams had played for 22 seasons to host it. Williams was 80 years old. He was wheelchair-bound, weakened by age and the early stages of the cardiac disease that would kill him 3 years later. He could walk only a few steps. His body had failed him in ways that would have been unimaginable to the young man who had once legged out triples and thrown runners out from left field with a cannon arm. But his mind was sharp, his wit was intact. His eyes, those legendary 20/10 eyes, still burned with the competitive fire that had defined his entire existence. During the pre-game festivities, the nominees for the Major League Baseball All-Century team were introduced one by one. The greatest players in the history of the sport walked onto the Fenway Park grass to standing ovations. Hank Aaron, Willie Mays, Stan Musial, then the announcer called the final name. Williams was brought to the pitcher's mound on a golf cart because his legs could no longer carry him that far. When the cart stopped and he stood up, unsteady but upright, the crowd at Fenway Park erupted with a sound that went beyond cheering. It was love. Pure, unfiltered, decades in the making love for a man who had tormented them and thrilled them and frustrated them and amazed them for the better part of the 20th century. Tony Gwynn, the San Diego Padres hitting star and a fellow San Diegan who had befriended Williams years earlier at the 1992 All-Star Game, gently took his arm and helped steady him on his feet. The ovation continued. It did not stop. It grew louder and louder until the sound seemed to physically hold Williams upright. Then the current All-Stars did something nobody had planned. They surrounded him. Mark McGwire, who had just hit 70 home runs the previous season. Ken Griffey Jr., the most popular player in baseball. Cal Ripken Jr., the Iron Man who had broken Gehrig's consecutive games record. Nomar Garcia-Peda, Pedro Martinez, who would go on to strike out the first 5 batters of the game. The best players in the world crowded around the greatest hitter who ever lived like children meeting their hero for the first time. They were not performing for the cameras. They were genuinely, visibly starstruck. Williams threw the ceremonial first pitch to Carlton Fisk, the former Red Sox catcher and fellow Hall of Famer, while the crowd continued to roar, and then Ted Williams did something he had never done in his 22 years as a player. Something the city of Boston had begged him to do for 4 decades. Something he had stubbornly, defiantly, infamously refused to do through a 4-06 season, through a final home run, through every curtain call the fans had ever given him. He waved his cap to the crowd. Fenway Park came apart. The sound was not a cheer. It was a release, 40 years of pent-up longing from a city that had loved a man who refused to acknowledge that love, from fans who had stood and applauded and pleaded with him to tip his cap, and been met with nothing but the back of his head as he walked into the dugout. Now, at 80, in a wheelchair at the end of his life, surrounded by the greatest players of 2 generations, he finally acknowledged it. He tipped his cap, and the city wept. Afterward, Williams said simply, "Wasn't it great? I can only describe it as great." It was the perfect farewell. It should have been the last image of Ted Williams that America ever held. The old man on the mound at Fenway, surrounded by the game's greatest players, tipping his cap at last, the city roaring, the tears falling, the story ending exactly the way it should have ended. But the story did not end there. The cap tip was not the final chapter. There was another chapter coming, one that nobody could have imagined, one that would overshadow everything else about Ted Williams's death and become one of the most disturbing stories in the history of American sports. In November of 2000, Williams was hospitalized at Shands Hospital in Gainesville, Florida, for cardiac problems. He was 82 years old and facing the real possibility that he might not survive the upcoming surgery. While in the hospital, in a room where fear and mortality hung in the air, he signed a handwritten document along with John Henry and Claudia. The document was written on a piece of paper. It was not typed. It was not prepared by an attorney. It was not witnessed by anyone outside the family. It read, "JHW. Claudia and Dad all agree to be put into biostasis after we die. This is what we want, to be able to be together in the future, even if it is only a chance." The document directly contradicted Williams' 1996 will, a formal, legally executed instrument that clearly and unambiguously stated his desire to be cremated, and his ashes scattered over the Florida Keys, over the fishing waters he had loved for decades. Bobby Jo Ferrell, Williams' eldest daughter from his first marriage, knew nothing about the biostasis agreement. She had not been invited to the hospital. She had not been consulted. She would later say that in her 53 years of knowing her father, he had told her repeatedly, and had told everyone around him, that he wanted to be cremated. The biostasis pact, she believed, was not her father's wish. It was her brother's idea, signed by an elderly man facing surgery who may not have fully understood what he was agreeing to. Williams had a pacemaker implanted that same month. In January of 2001, he underwent open-heart surgery at New York Presbyterian Hospital. He survived, but his health never recovered. He suffered additional strokes over the next 18 months. His body weakened steadily. His legs failed, his heart struggled. He spent his final year and a half confined largely to his Citrus Hills home, watching Red Sox games on television, receiving occasional visitors who found him diminished but still mentally present, still capable of arguing about hitting, still insisting that he knew more about the swing than anyone alive. He was still Ted Williams. Even at the end, he was still Ted Williams. On the morning of July 5th, Bobby Jo Ferrell was horrified. She immediately retained an attorney and filed a lawsuit to recover her father's body for cremation, arguing that the 1996 will, a formal, legally executed document, represented his true and final wishes. The biostasis pact, she argued, was a handwritten note signed under dubious circumstances by an aging, ailing man who was about to undergo heart surgery and may not have fully understood what he was agreeing to. In my 53 years, my dad has told me, and anyone that was around him knew, that his wishes were to be cremated, Bobby Joe told reporters. My dad would flip out if he could see what was going on, and he would flip out if his son was going to do that to him. John Henry and Claudia countered that the biostasis pact was genuine, that their father had willingly signed it, and that his desire to be frozen with his children reflected a change of heart that superseded the earlier will. Their attorney produced the document. Laboratory analysis determined that the signature appeared genuine and that forgery could not be proved beyond a reasonable doubt. The legal battle dragged on through the summer and into the fall. It was ugly, public, and devastating. The family that Ted Williams had already fractured through 3 divorces and decades of emotional distance was now shredding itself in open court over the question of whether his body should rest in the ocean or in a freezer. In October of 2002, the case was settled. Bobby Joe agreed not to publicly discuss the disposition of her father's remains. John Henry and Claudia agreed to pay Bobby Joe her share of the inheritance. Ted Williams stayed frozen. The story grew darker after the settlement. A Sports Illustrated investigation conducted in cooperation with Larry Johnson, a former Alcor chief operating officer turned whistleblower, revealed details that made the already disturbing story genuinely horrifying. The consent form that Alcor required for cryopreservation had been submitted after Williams was already dead, with his signature line completely empty. 8 of 182 DNA samples taken from Williams went missing from the facility. At least one Alcor board member had discussed using Williams' remains as a bargaining chip to pressure John Henry into paying the $111,000 he still owed the organization from the original $136,000 bill. John Henry Williams passed away of leukemia on March 6, 2004. He was 35 years old. Reports indicated his body was also sent to Alcor. The son who had arranged his father's cryopreservation had followed him into the steel tanks, just as the handwritten pact had stipulated. They were together now, father and son, in a warehouse in the desert. Whether that was what Ted Williams truly wanted is a question that will never be answered. Bobby Joe Ferrell passed away in 2014. She never stopped believing her father's true wish was cremation. She went to her own grave, believing her brother had stolen her father's body. On the evening of July 5, 2002, the night Ted Williams passed away, the grounds crew at Fenway Park mowed a giant number 9 into the left field grass. It was visible from every seat in the ballpark. Thousands of fans gathered outside the stadium to mourn. The Red Sox played the Detroit Tigers that night, and the game went on because games always go on, and because Ted Williams would have wanted them to play. Inside Fenway, the fans cheered every Red Sox hit a little louder than usual. They stood for every ovation a little longer. They looked out at left field, the position where Williams had stood for 22 years, and they saw the number 9 carved into the grass, and they remembered the man who had played there with a fury and a brilliance that nobody before or since has matched. Ted Williams played 19 seasons for the Boston Red Sox. He batted .344 with 521 home runs and 1,839 runs batted in. He had the highest on-base percentage in baseball history at .482, a number that has not been seriously challenged in more than 6 decades. He won 6 batting titles, 2 Triple Crowns, 2 MVP awards, and was selected to 19 All-Star teams. He lost nearly 5 full seasons to 2 wars, flew 39 combat missions over Korea, crash-landed a burning jet, and came back both times to resume being the greatest hitter who ever lived, as if nothing had happened. He was the last man to hit 400. He was the first white Hall of Famer to advocate for Negro League players. He was a Marine who served when he did not have to. He was a fisherman who could cast a fly line with the same precision he used to drive a fastball over the left field wall. He was the greatest hitter who ever lived. He said so himself as an 8-year-old boy, and then he spent the next 75 years proving it. He wanted to be cremated. His will said so. He wanted his ashes scattered over the Florida Keys, over the salt water where he had found peace, over the ocean that had given him the only serenity his restless, combative, brilliant mind had ever known. He wanted to disappear into the water the way he had disappeared into the dugout after every standing ovation, quietly, without fanfare, without tipping his cap. Instead, he is in a steel tank in an industrial park in Scottsdale, Arizona. There is no grave to visit. There is no headstone to read. There is no resting place where fans can go to leave flowers or baseballs or letters. The man who wrote the book on hitting does not have a final chapter that anyone can visit. The man who advocated for Satchel Paige's dignity was denied his own. On the night he passed away, the grounds crew at Fenway Park mowed a giant number 9 into the left field grass. It was visible from every seat in the ballpark. Thousands of fans gathered outside the stadium. The Red Sox played the Detroit Tigers that night, and the game went on, because games always go on, and because Ted Williams, who never missed a game he did not have to miss, would have wanted them to play. Inside Fenway, the fans cheered every Red Sox hit a little louder than usual. They stood for every ovation a little longer. They looked out at left field, the position where Williams had stood for 22 years, and they saw the number 9 carved into the grass, and they remembered. The cap tip at Fenway, 1999. That should have been the ending. The old man on the mound, surrounded by the game's greatest, waving to the crowd at last, the city roaring, the tears falling, the perfect goodbye. That should have been the ending. It was not. Like and subscribe for more baseball documentaries. Until next time.